The moment Caitlin Clark sat down across from Sue Bird, you could tell this wasn't going to be one of those polite, media-trained interviews where every answer is wrapped in a bow. The body language was different, sharper, more deliberate. Sue opened with a simple, "How are you really doing?" And Clark did what she's been building toward all season. She dropped the filter. From the first 5 minutes, it was clear she wasn't just talking about basketball. She was talking about survival, about what it's like to be the face of a league that,
if you're here for the real story and not the filtered version, subscribe. And if you're sticking around for the next meltdown, you better definitely subscribe.
in her words, loves you when you're selling jerseys, but goes quiet when you're getting beat up on the floor. And if the WNBA's top brass thought Caitlin was going to play nice, they couldn't have been more wrong. She started with the targeting, and not in a vague, the league's physical kind of way. She named names: Angel Reese, Chindi Carter, the hits that weren't called, the shoves, elbows, and blind sides that happen away from the ball. Sue raised an eyebrow, giving her space to continue, and Clark leaned in. They knew they could do it. They knew it wouldn't get called. And once they realized there weren't going to be consequences, it just kept escalating. That's not basketball. That's sanctioned bullying. That word, bullying, hung in the air. It wasn't hyperbole. Clark explained the difference between playing physical and playing predatory. The former is part of the game. The latter, she said, is a tactic you use when you can't match skill with skill. From there, she moved to the part of the story that's been whispered about, but never really confirmed until now: the injuries. Everyone knew Clark had been playing through pain, but the way she described it made you wonder how she even stayed upright some nights. She detailed the constant full-court pressure, the off-ball holds, the forearm checks to the ribs, the hip pointers that never had time to heal. And then came the most damning part: her account of how she was handled when those injuries piled up. They told me to keep going. Rehab in the morning, treatment all day, then full minutes in the game. And if you can't practice, doesn't matter, you're still starting. I told them my body was screaming at me, and it felt like the answer was always, "We need you out there." It wasn't just physical exhaustion. She talked about the mental toll, how the constant pain changes the way you play, the way you think, even the way you see yourself. Sue, who's been through a share of injuries, nodded knowingly. But the difference, Clark pointed out, was that in her case, there was no veteran-friendly pacing, no real load management. They treated every game like it was the playoffs. I get it, tickets were selling, TV ratings were up, but I'm not a product. I'm a person. And there were nights I felt like they forgot that. And that's when the conversation turned to coaching. Specifically, Stephanie White. Clark didn't sugarcoat it. She talked about the lack of adjustments, about being run into the ground with the same offensive sets regardless of how her body was holding up. She said there was no real understanding of how to protect her as a player, either from a physical standpoint or from the game plan itself. The defense knew exactly what we were going to run. They knew where I'd be when I'd get the ball, and that made me a target. We didn't adapt. In college, Lisa Bludder knew how to keep you guessing. She kept us fresh. She made sure everyone knew their role. With Stephanie, it felt like we were just winging it. She wasn't petty or vindictive in tone. It was almost sad, like she wanted this to work but had run out of reasons to believe it could. Then came the subject that's been lurking just beneath the surface all season: the racial dynamics. Clark didn't dance around it. She spoke about the way some officials seemed to bristle at her, how certain media voices try to frame her success as purely a product of marketing hype, not skill. She mentioned the way her presence in the league was sometimes used as a wedge in conversations about representation, rather than as part of a larger picture of growing the game. There's this idea that if you praise me, you're taking something away from somebody else. And I hate that because I want everybody in this league to shine. But I also can't ignore that the standard I'm held to feels different. And sometimes that's about more than just basketball. Sue let the silence sit for a moment, knowing the weight of what Clark had just said. The All-Star game came up almost as an afterthought, but Clark didn't hold back there either. She called it disorganized and more about optics than players. She said the lack of structure made it hard to even enjoy the experience, and she questioned whether the event was really about celebrating the athletes or just filling a TV slot. It's like they wanted the photo ops, but not the work it takes to make it a real showcase for the league. I've been in better-run charity tournaments. What made the interview so explosive wasn't just what Caitlin said. It was who she said it to. Sue Bird isn't just a 4-time champion and 5-time Olympic gold medalist. She's someone who's seen every side of the league, from rookie to veteran to broadcaster. She knows when a player's venting and when a player's blowing the whistle. And make no mistake, Caitlin Clark was blowing the whistle. The fallout started almost immediately after the episode went live. Clips of her calling out Stephanie White flooded social media. Former players chimed in, some applauding her honesty, others warning her about the backlash that comes with going public. WNBA insiders said privately that this kind of candor, while rare, was exactly what the league needed if it was going to fix its deeper issues. Fans were split. Some felt she was being too critical too soon in her career. Others said this was exactly why she's become a generational figure, because she's not afraid to confront the uncomfortable truths that everyone else skirts around. In the end, what Caitlin Clark did in that interview was bigger than venting about a rough season. She laid out a blueprint for change. Protect your stars, adapt your coaching, respect your players as people, and address the biases, overt or subtle, that shape how they're treated. For the WNBA, it's a choice. They can treat her words as an attack, or they can treat them as a warning. Because if a player like Caitlin Clark, who has brought so much attention, money, and new fans to the league, feels this disrespected and unprotected, what does that say to the next wave of talent? As Sue Bird wrapped the interview, she looked Caitlin in the eye and said, "You know you just shook the table, right?" Clark smiled, not with arrogance, but with the calm of someone who knows the truth doesn't need dressing up. "Good," she said. It needed to be shaken. What Caitlin Clark did in that Sue Bird interview didn't just make headlines. It set off a chain reaction that's now spilling into locker rooms, front offices, and even the boardrooms of WNBA sponsors. Because when a player of her stature decides to go on record about the league's failures, it's not just venting. It's creating a moment that forces everybody, coaches, executives, owners, to either pick a side or pretend they didn't hear her. And judging by the whispers coming out since that interview dropped, pretending not to hear her is no longer an option. The ripple inside the Fever locker room. One of the first things insiders noticed after the interview aired was the sudden shift in how players in Indiana were talking, both to the media and to each other. Several teammates, who had been careful all season to keep their critiques generic, "We need to execute better, we've got to play as a team," have started to echo Clark's points more openly. Not in a coordinated mutiny, but in a way that suggests her candor gave them permission to speak up. The most telling sign? Practices reportedly feel different now. Fewer just trust the system speeches from coaches, more discussions about player input in game planning. It's not a revolution yet, but the temperature has definitely changed. The coaching world is watching. Stephanie White might not have been expecting to be name-checked in a conversation that would reach millions, but now every WNBA coach knows what's at stake. In private, some coaches are saying this interview is a wake-up call. It's a reminder that the job isn't just about drawing up plays. It's about managing the health, career, and trust of your most valuable players. And in a league where so much of the marketing revolves around individual stars, losing the trust of one could be a career-defining mistake. One coaching veteran put it bluntly to a colleague: "If she can go on Sue Bird's show and torture coach, what's stopping anyone else?" The sponsor side-eye. Big money sponsors don't like mess, unless they can turn it into a marketing win. Nike, Gatorade, and other Clark partners have invested millions into her image as the fresh, fearless face of basketball. So when she paints a picture of being overworked, targeted, and unsupported, that story reflects back on the WNBA's brand. Sponsors want their star athletes protected because injuries and burnout hurt their own return on investment. If they start feeling like the league isn't a safe place for talent, they have leverage to push for change or to shift their money elsewhere. The union angle. The WNBPA has been quieter than some expected, but behind the scenes, this interview just handed them a talking point they couldn't have scripted better. When they go into the next round of negotiations, they can now cite not just statistics or hypothetical scenarios, but firsthand, high-profile account of the league failing its biggest draw. Caitlin's words about being forced to play through injury, about a lack of adaptation to protect her, are essentially a union rep's dream because they crystallize why player protections need to be non-negotiable in the next CBA. The media divide. Clark's decision to name names and call out systemic problems has split the sports media landscape. On one side, you've got commentators applauding her courage, framing her as a leader in the same vein as athletes who've historically forced their leagues to evolve. On the other, there are voices accusing her of being unprofessional or entitled, suggesting she should earn her stripes before challenging the system. The fascinating part? Even the critics can't ignore her. She's dominating the conversation, which means her grievances, valid or not in their eyes, are being discussed at every level of sports media. The officiating question. One undercurrent in Caitlin's interview that's starting to gain traction is the role officiating has played in her frustrations. She didn't go deep on it with Sue Bird, but the implication was clear. If referees had been more consistent and protective, much of the targeting might have been curbed early. Now officiating crews are in an awkward spot. Call games too loosely, and they feed her narrative. Call them too tightly, and they risk looking like they're overcompensating because of one interview. Either way, Caitlin's presence has now become part of the mental math in every officiating crew's pregame meeting. Racial dynamics and the backlash cycle. Clark's comments about racial discrimination were as direct as anything said in the WNBA this season. By pointing out how her successes are sometimes framed as a zero-sum against other players, she put her finger on one of the most sensitive topics in the sport. Predictably, this part of the interview sparked the sharpest debates. Some players and media members have defended her point as an honest reflection of what she's experienced. Others have accused her of oversimplifying or misunderstanding the broader conversation around race in sports. But here's the thing. Even disagreement keeps the issue alive. Every think piece, every podcast segment, every tweet dissecting her words just adds to the visibility of the underlying problem. Impact on rookies and young stars. For players entering the league next season, Clark's interview may serve as both a warning and a template. The warning, the WNBA grind is real, and if you're not proactive about managing your workload and advocating for yourself, the system won't always protect you. The template, if you do speak up, make sure you've built a platform big enough to withstand the pushback. Clark didn't burn bridges because she didn't need those bridges to survive. Her fanbase, sponsors, and visibility give her leverage that most rookies don't have. The Sue Bird factor. Sue's role in this can't be overstated. She's not a gotcha journalist fishing for controversy. She's a respected peer whose platform carries credibility. If Clark had made these comments to a random podcast or gossip outlet, they could have been brushed off as clickbait. But coming in a long-form conversation with one of the most respected figures in the sport, that's a different weight class. Sue also played it smart. She didn't sensationalize the answers, didn't push for sound bites. She gave Clark room to breathe and tell the story in her own words, which made it harder for critics to claim she was taken out of context. Long-term implications for Stephanie White. There's no way to spin this. Being singled out as the problem in a public interview by the league's biggest star is career-altering. Even if White survives the season, her reputation around the league is now under a microscope. Any future player-coach relationship she has will come with the unspoken question, will she have my back, or will I end up in a Caitlin Clark situation? The league's next move. Now comes the real test. How does the WNBA respond? Do they go quiet and hope the news cycle moves on? Do they issue a vague, we take player safety seriously statement? Or do they take tangible action, better officiating directives, clearer injury protocols, open dialogue with players about workload management? The safest PR play might be silence, but silence has a way of validating the criticism in situations like this. The bolder move would be to acknowledge the flaws, promise reforms, and then actually deliver them. The interview wasn't just a venting session. It was a shift in the power dynamic. Caitlin Clark sent a clear message. She's not here to quietly play along while the system grinds her down. And whether the league embraces that challenge or resists It will tell us everything about where the WNBA is headed in the next few years. If they're smart, they'll realize this isn't just about one player. It's about every player watching to see if speaking the truth actually leads to change. Because the truth is out there now, and it's not going back in a bottle. If Caitlin Clark's interview was an earthquake, then the aftershocks are now being felt in every corner of the women's basketball ecosystem, and not just inside the WNBA. Because what she did wasn't just airing grievances. It was a public declaration that the way things have always been done is no longer acceptable. And when someone with her level of influence draws that line in the sand, you can bet people start rethinking their positions, whether they admit it out loud or not. College coaches are taking notes. One group that has been paying very close attention: college coaches. While Clark's criticisms were aimed at her pro environment, every coach at the NCAA level knows that part of their recruiting pitch involves selling a vision of what comes after college. When a player's first pro experience is described as being overworked, underprotected, and strategically mismanaged, that's a recruiting liability. Now, college programs, especially those with top 10 prospects, will be doubling down on preparing players not just for the speed and physicality of the pros, but for the politics of it. You might see more emphasis on teaching athletes how to advocate for themselves, manage media narratives, and navigate the business side from day one. For some, it's also a selling point. If you come here, we'll make sure you're ready to handle exactly what Caitlin went through and avoid the same mistakes. Agents smell opportunity. Player agents, especially those working with incoming rookies, have been handed a golden example of why their role is so critical. Before this interview, a lot of rookies came into the WNBA wide-eyed, grateful for the opportunity, and hesitant to push back. Now, agents have an example they can point to when advising clients. If the league's most marketable player can be put in a position like this, imagine what happens to you without someone protecting your interests. Expect to see more aggressive contract negotiations, not just over money, but over health protocols, marketing commitments, and even clauses about public representation. Caitlin's story will be woven into every pitch for why an agent's job isn't just about getting paid, but about protecting a career. The fan base is splintering in new ways. The most interesting reaction to Clark's words hasn't just been in the media, it's in the fan base. Some fans have doubled down in their support for her, seeing her as a truth teller who's refusing to be silenced. They're buying more jerseys, flooding comment sections, and calling out the league in her defense. Others, however, have shifted into what can only be called protect the league at all costs mode. For them, Clark's comments are seen as unnecessarily divisive or even damaging to the WNBA's growth narrative. This isn't just a debate about one player anymore. It's turning into a larger conversation about whether public criticism helps or hurts women's sports. The result? A fan culture that's becoming more vocal, more political, and more willing to call out both sides when they feel something's off. International leagues are watching closely. European and Australian basketball leagues have been keeping an eye on the Caitlin Clark phenomenon since her college days. This interview may have just made their jobs easier when it comes to luring talent overseas. Why? Because they can now pitch themselves as an alternative, a place where star players are celebrated, protected, and given the resources they need without the same level of grind and politics. If the WNBA doesn't course correct, they risk creating a perception that the best way to preserve your career is to avoid spending too much time in the league. For international leagues looking to raise their own profiles, that's a marketing gift. A new kind of player empowerment era. The NBA has had its player empowerment era for over a decade, with stars like LeBron James dictating terms of where they play, who they play with, and even the shape of team rosters. Until now, the WNBA has had flashes of that dynamic, but nothing sustained. Clark's interview may be the tipping point. Her willingness to speak openly about her dissatisfaction could embolden other stars to demand more say in everything from training loads to roster construction. Imagine if top players began negotiating not just salary, but veto power over trades or input into team staffing decisions. It sounds bold now, but so did LeBron's decision in 2010. And look how that reshaped the NBA. Impact on youth basketball participation. Caitlin Clark is a role model for millions of young players. Normally, that influence is measured in jersey sales, camp signups, and increased participation in youth leagues. But here's the new wrinkle. Her openness about the darker sides of pro life may also inspire young athletes to approach their careers differently. They'll understand earlier that talent alone isn't enough, that you have to be strategic about who you trust when you push back and how you protect your own body. This could lead to a new generation of players who enter the WNBA far more business savvy than their predecessors, less willing to accept the pay your dues quietly culture. The Stephanie White dilemma for the league. The WNBA now has a PR problem with one of its own coaches in the crosshairs. If they defend Stephanie White too aggressively, they risk looking like they're dismissing Clark's legitimate concerns. If they throw White under the bus, they signal to every coach in the league that one high-profile player can tank your career overnight. Neither outcome is great for stability. That's why, behind closed doors, there's likely a lot of discussion about mediation, a way to publicly present that differences have been addressed while avoiding any perception of punishment or favoritism. The injury management precedent. One of the biggest bombshells from Clark's account was being pushed to play through injury without adequate rest. If left unaddressed, this sets a precedent that can be used against the league in future disputes. You can bet the league's legal team is now advising franchises to document every medical decision, get explicit sign-offs from players, and tighten up injury protocols. Because if Clark's account is ever backed by medical records or teammate corroboration, the fallout could include lawsuits. And that's before you even get to the PR damage. Pressure on media partners. Networks like ESPN and Amazon, which carry WNBA games, are in an awkward position. Clark is one of their main draws, but they also have relationships with the league and its coaches. If her criticisms start affecting public perception of the WNBA's professionalism, those broadcasters may push for changes to ensure the on-court product and the off-court narratives don't undermine their investment. They have money on the line, and that means leverage. The long game for Caitlin Clark's legacy. The real question now isn't whether this interview will fade. It's whether Clark is prepared for the long game. Speaking out once is powerful, but sustaining pressure without burning bridges is a delicate art. If she manages it, she could become a transformative figure in the WNBA, forcing structural changes that benefit every player. If she mishandles it, she risks being framed as a disruptor who hurt team cohesion. This isn't just a storyline for the 2024 season. It's a pivot point in the league's history. Whether you agree with her or not, Caitlin Clark just redefined what it means to be a star in the WNBA. And the ripple effects are only beginning.